Dearest Heavenly Father, we thank you again for the opportunity and the privilege to be able to meet together this way. And we just thank you for all your provision for each one of us, for our families, for all the blessings that you continue to pour out upon us. Sometimes we may not recognize them as blessings, but we just accept that you know what's best. And we do ask, Father, that you'll help us to make right decisions and to be able to see and understand messages and truths that you are sharing with us. And we just ask, Father, for a blessing today for all those who are here. And we also ask for a blessing on those who have not been able to make it. But we especially ask that your Holy Spirit will be with us now, both in sharing the message and in receiving the messages. And I thank you again for your blessings and your mercy. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so as I said, some of you may have seen this presentation, not many, but just in the Rue Fellowship, but it's actually going to be a little bit different because I've changed some things. So basically what I'm looking at today are 6 psychological theories. It's looking at how we think and how our brains use fast brain thinking for so many things that we don't even really consider, because it's things that we've been doing from the time we were pretty much born. And it's basically involving our social and our psychological conditioning, as I say, likely beginning really before birth almost. And so it's good to be able to have reasons to examine ourselves and question things, and to be able to perhaps make decisions not so much on the automatic responses that we may be inclined to do, but also from giving thought and consideration and logic, as opposed to just the automatic way we think. So what we're covering today is some of the ways that we do think automatically. So today, when we're going through the study, I want to consider these 2 points primarily. How have these principles impacted our views and understanding of equality? And also, how have these principles impacted our views and understanding around conspiracy theories? Because these are 2 big issues that have affected us through the past couple of years. So basically, I've got a list here of presentations that Elder Tess has done, starting in May. Most of them are in May and June last year. However, the equality aspects have obviously really reached a peak a bit more in recent presentations. And she discussed in the early presentations last year about, she did a compare and contrast with ancient and modern Israel and traced how that has followed through with Protestantism, and also how Seventh-day Adventists have adopted a lot of that conservative Protestant mentality or mindset. And I think for most of us, we've got a background to some degree in that. For me, I was actually quite grounded in conservative Protestantism before I became a conservative Adventist. And so I'm really grounded in it quite well. And so this has been an interesting study for me. So hopefully it will be for you as well. So basically, just looking at my things here. So she also covered the Apis bull mentality and how that impacted and still impacts us today. It still affects our thinking today. It's still something we do almost automatically because it's very ingrained, and I think it's ingrained because of some of the principles we want to go through today. So just reminding you again of the 2 things I want us to think about today. Keep in mind as we're going through, and it's really easy to see how these things impact other people. We can often see these things in other people, but really our most important thing is to be able to look at ourselves and see how these things occur in our thinking. So keep in mind our views and understanding of equality, as well as our views and understanding around conspiracy theories. So I was just mentioning how we came through Protestantism to Adventism, and Adventism has adopted a lot of that conservative mindset of the basically of Protestantism, and still today are very much on a par with a lot of the conservative thinking. So we have to question whether that includes us, or whether we are going to be open to hearing God's messages, because we need to be able to come to a better understanding of how God thinks, which is not necessarily how we've traditionally thought. So where am I up to? So moving along, I'll just take you to this image here. Okay, there we go. So we want to consider understanding psychology and equality. This diagram just illustrates a little bit of what we've looked at as well, things like sexual orientation, national origin, all sorts of things we see in the world where people are not necessarily considered on the same level as others. So we also look at the conspiracy chart. I've just found this image, which you probably can't read all the details, and that's okay. Basically, what this is talking about is really what I want you to see is it starts at the bottom down here, and it says grounded in reality. And it might involve things like, you know, the FBI spied on John Lennon is one of the things that it says. It may be talking about things that actually happened. Actually, I'll just go to the next slide because it'll show you a little bit more. So things that actually happened, and then it works its way up and goes back to the top, which is detached from reality. So we go back to here, it progresses up to here, where things start to become, you start to leave reality, then you start to go into denying science, and then eventually, if you keep following that path, you end up at this point where, you know, you could be believing in all sorts of things that are really detached from reality. And hopefully none of us are in that path, at least anymore. I mean, I have certainly been in that path in the past, and it's been challenging to be able to stop and look at how I think and why, and be able to review things. But at the same time, praise God that he's been able to bring these messages to us. So how do our brains work? And that's what we want to cover a little bit about today. And, you know, basically we know that maths plays an important part in how our brains work. In fact, it plays an important part in how the world works. So a definition of mathematics, the abstract science of number, quantity, and space, either as abstract concepts or as applied to other disciplines such as physics and engineering or applied mathematics. So this picture here, I'm not really going through all the physical makeup of the brain, but we know that the brain's a complex structure, and we're not talking about necessarily the physical aspects of it today, but we're talking about how it actually works. How do we think? And we want to look at that in the context of psychological theories and what they are. Now, before I go on, I'll just mention, I'm trying to make sure that I can get through this within the time slot if possible, but I don't want to rush things. So, but certainly stop me if you want to ask any questions. So I'm not sort of asking questions all the way through or anything. I'm just going through the presentation, but feel free to interrupt me if there's something I haven't covered, or if you've got a question, or at any point. That would be great. So psychological theories, basically, what are they? It has to describe a behavior. They make predictions about future behaviors, and they must have evidence to support the idea. And they also must be testable, and that's really important. Now, just getting onto our 6 psychological theories, there are more, obviously, but I've just picked 6 that are fairly common ones. So we'll go to the first one, and that's pattern recognition. Now, actually, I will ask a question here. Can anybody tell me what you think that is a picture of? If someone would like to just let me know what you think that's a picture of. If you can.
It looks like a fingerprint.
It does. And it's interesting that I think most of us here would recognize that and think it is a fingerprint. So it's because of the pattern, clearly. So it's an example of how we recognize the pattern. It's also a lot more than that, which I'll go into. And we're talking about maths being the basis of everything, and pattern recognition involves maths. And we have a oh, hello, went too fast. There we go. We have a mathematical universe. So everything in the universe and us, really around us, involves mathematics. I'm not a mathematician by any means, shape or form. However, we can't really avoid having some understanding of math. We have to have a basic understanding of at least some of these principles. And just to take you through, one of the first things I wanted to discuss in regards to patterns is Fibonacci numbers. So these are the Fibonacci numbers at the top, and the golden ratio, which is really the relationship between those numbers. And this is something that was found, let me just get to my bits of information. They were, hold on, I'm having trouble. My mouse is working very slow, which is a little bit frustrating. Let me just get back to there. Okay, so back in 1202, a fellow by the name of Leonardo da Pisa, he was later known as Leonardo Fibonacci, he wrote a book called Book of Calculation. And at the time, it was more popular to use Roman numerals. However, he worked out these sequences using Arabic numerals. So that was a little bit radical for his day. And he located these patterns. And so that ended up producing what we often recognize. Now, before I just go here, why is that? There we go. So what is Fibonacci numbers? This is just oops, gone too far again. Like I said, my mouse is playing up, sorry. So a sequence of numbers and a corresponding ratio that reflects various patterns found in nature, from the swirl of a pine cone seed to the curve of a nautilus shell to the twist of a hurricane. So these are patterns that we find everywhere we go in the world. And these are the Fibonacci numbers drawn in a pattern that you can recognize. And I'll just go through and show you also how we see these things in everyday life. And here are some real life examples. So this is a head of Roman cauliflower or Roman broccoli, and you'll notice they're little cones. And when you actually zero in or focus in, you can see, looking down, you can see that swirl pattern. And it's all very much in an even, relatively even pattern. If we go to a sunflower, we see the pattern emerging in where the seeds all form in the middle, similar type of pattern. We can go to a constellation in outer space. Again, we see a similar pattern. We can also look at artwork, Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. And this is an interesting one to me because you sort of question, well, did he actually know that's what he was doing? I'm sort of thinking he probably did because he was a pretty clever person. So he probably did this on purpose. That's my assumption. I don't really know if there's any evidence for that. Whether he did or not, the pattern's there. So he's either done it automatically or he knew what he was doing. And if we look at our faces, oops, I've gone too far. If we look at our faces even, we can see the patterns in the shape of our faces. And we know that it's been shown that when they've done studies on this, that the closer someone's facial features match these proportions, the more good looking they're considered to be. So it's something that's pleasing to our eye, apparently. And getting back to that fingerprint, we know that the patterns in our fingers are all based around that swirl. We've got the proportions of our knuckles and our hands. They're all relative. And of course, the other thing that we know, just considering bringing that back to our message, we know that we rely on patterns. We rely on patterns in line upon line. In our history, we go back and we look at patterns because that actually helps us understand where we are today. And I can take you to one example here. This is where we can see Adventism through the Great Controversy era compared with the 144,000 line. And you can see that there's matching points along the way. We can compare and contrast, and the patterns are what enables us to basically glean more information. God uses patterns because we are naturally inclined toward patterns. And here's another one where, this is where Elder Tess was comparing and contrasting ancient and modern Israel. She was talking about how they basically, you've got your failure, success, the alpha and the omega. You can see all of that, and you can see the patterns emerging from that. You can see the similarities. They're not exact. Obviously, you've got a 400-year darkness, captivity, etc. at the top, and 1200 at the bottom, 1260, sorry. So every detail isn't exact, but you can see the pattern and you can see the similarities, and you can glean information from all of the points that you can then work into or understand better where we are today in our dispensation. So that's the first point. So we'll move on to the second, which is the more exposure effect, or the familiarity principle. So this is another one of our psychological theories. And basically, this is a phenomenon where people tend to have a preference for things just because they're familiar with them. It's just how we tend to think, and we like things that we're used to. So it kind of also reminds me of by beholding we become changed. We get changed into whatever we become familiar with often. So it's something to be aware of. And basically, I looked at this, and also it reminded me of what ancient Israel did when they were brought out of captivity from Egypt. Moses led them out. He ascends Mount Sinai to get the tables of the law. And while he's gone, they're used to having someone to tell them what to do, I guess. They were anxious about the fact there wasn't a leader. Maybe they were bored. I don't know exactly what really prompted them to do what they did. But we know at the time they resorted to familiarity. They went back and basically they built something that was familiar to them, and it was based on the Apis bull. They created the golden calf, even though in their mind, this was kind of like it was probably, they thought they were doing a good thing, I guess, because it was their representation of God, and they thought this was all good things. All the things that the Apis bull represented to them, they were familiar with. So they used that principle, resorted to that without really understanding what it was they were doing. So just moving to our next one, the third one. This one's a really interesting one. It's cognitive bias. So what is cognitive bias? Well, basically we know it's a systematic error in thinking that occurs when people are processing and interpreting information in the world around them. And if you remember, Elder Parminder was talking about this in a couple of his presentations, where he was talking about how easy it is for us to recognize bias in other people. It's a lot harder to recognize bias in ourselves, but we all have it because it's something we've grown up with. It's something we've just learned throughout our lives, and frequently we're doing it without even realizing. So this is part of the purpose of today's study is to start to recognize what these automatic functions are. Now, this is a diagram which you don't need to read all the little writing. I'm sure you can't. Even I have trouble with it at the moment. But the point is, this is a cognitive bias codex. Now, the point I'm making here is I'm going to go through 12 different biases just to become familiar with how they are and how we function. But you'll notice that there's a lot, and you can break them down from this to this to this level. And so there's such a lot when if you were really going to get into the study, which we're not to that degree today. And just to understand this corner at the bottom here is kind of representing the fast brain reactions to things. And that's something we need to become more aware of. Now, I don't know if anybody recognizes any of these points, but these are things that some of us are inclined to do. And if you do find you're doing them, then you're going to find this is actually examples of bias. I'm just checking the chat. Do we prefer, sorry, Ray, sorry, I didn't mean to miss your chat. Familiarity principle. Do we prefer this because we have a predetermined response to familiar settings? We can function comfortable on a default. Yeah, I believe that's a big part of it, because looking at that codex, it talks about how we create shortcuts. We want things to be quick. We have a natural inclination as human beings toward comfort, towards speed, towards shortcuts, towards reduced effort. I think that's just how we tend to function. So anything that takes more effort, we tend to avoid. So I think the familiarity principle helps support that. It helps support what's it's quicker, it's easier, but we also have, it's also a preference. So it's also not just, I think it's not just because it's quicker, but I think that's part of it. I think the familiarity is something we get to like more. So we actually have an affection, if you like, for want of a better word, toward things that are familiar. Unless they're horrible things, of course, that's another thing. So maybe familiar things evoke a bit more emotion out of us. And if they're nice, familiar things, we tend to like them more, and we tend to like our comfort zone for many reasons. So thank you for that comment, Ray. Sorry, I didn't see it straight away. I have to keep an eye. So I'll just read through these. Thinking about thinking about our own behavior, do any of the following sound familiar? Only paying attention to news stories that confirm our opinions. Blaming outside factors when things don't go your way. Attributing other people's success to luck, but taking personal credit for your own accomplishments. Assuming everyone else shares your opinions or beliefs. Learning a little about a topic and then assuming you know all there is to know about it. So these are all examples or ways we can think that actually illustrate bias in our thinking. So as I said, I want to go through 12 examples of cognitive biases, and it's not an exhaustive list. However, as we go through them, I hope we can think about how these apply to our two questions that I asked in the first place about equality and also related to conspiracy theories. So getting down to the first one that I want to look at is anchoring bias. This is an interesting one. Anchoring bias explains how human beings tend to rely upon the first information they received on a topic. Now, this isn't just about what is familiar. It's actually about we tend to think that's correct, whatever it is. The information we've got, we tend to believe it. And then it's kind of hard to change our mind. And one example I thought of was like things like Santa Claus, even though that's kind of a funny example perhaps to use, but children are taught to believe that that's a real thing, and eventually they have to come to an understanding that it's not, but they really stick to it as a real thing for a long time if they're taught that. So another thing that was, yes. Hello?
Yeah, gossip.
Yes,
Gossip.
okay.
Yes, that's a really good example. Thank you, Marie. Gossip is something that probably involves a few different automatic responses, but certainly people will often hear something and then just believe it because they've heard it. So that's a good example. And that, not only that, it can anchor an opinion about that person in our mind that may influence how we treat them or how we think about them ongoing. And that would be some sort of an anchoring bias, I guess. Last week, we did have a really good example. Catherine brought up how an anchoring bias for her was how in her family, from a very young age, she knew that her father was the boss. Her father was the head of the house. And that was an anchoring bias for her as she was moving forward through life. And I think for many of us, that would be true, because if we've got very conservative backgrounds, it was a fairly solid social construct even a long time ago. It's less so now, socially speaking, but I think it's very alive and well in patriarchal conservative Christendom. So that's probably another good example. If anyone else has any other things, please feel free to just jump in. That would be great. So I just went too far, so I'll just go back. I'm clicking everything and getting the wrong thing. Things are moving. Okay, we're actually up to this one. Availability heuristic bias. So heuristic means a mental shortcut to make judgments quickly. So this is kind of a little bit what Ray was talking about. And people overestimate the importance of the information they have. So when we hear something and we want to accept whatever it is, we tend to think that's important. And as it says here, it's an example of our fast brain because it's going to save us time. It's just a quick shortcut. And it's also partly connected to what we see is all there is, or what you see is all there is. And we know Elder Parminder has talked about that as well. And we know that what we see very rarely is all there is. So we need to look a lot further and deeper than just what is at the first look or first glance. So bandwagon bias. So this is the next one. This explains why people follow the crowd. So if enough people believe something is true, more people will tend to believe that must be correct. So we like to, it's a bit of a herd mentality in a way. It's also, they call it in marketing, social proof. So the more people you have to say something is good, the more people will believe it is good. And that's why you have testimonials about things. So, but it applies in other things in our life in a more subtle way. So we assume if enough people believe it, then we just assume that it must be right. And we probably can recognize the fact that we've done this at some point in our lives. Now, D is choice supportive bias. So it's a natural response for people to defend the choices they make. We see advantages of our preferred choice and not the advantages of other options. And I think we can see why, along with other biases, why it could apply to people who are convinced that certain conspiracy theories are true and why they're reluctant to actually consider any available evidence to the contrary. So this is obviously, it's not one bias that comes into play with all of these things. It's a multiple things, but this is one that you can see it working in. So it also works regarding our socially acceptable views surrounding equality. So it's relevant to all of those things. The next one is confirmation bias. This bias explains why we are most likely to read or watch information supporting our current held beliefs. Again, this is basically where we are inclined to really just continue to support why we must be correct. In other words, we don't really like to look at why we're wrong. We want to look at why we're right. And again, this is another thing that happens with conspiracy theories, and it's easy to see other people doing that, especially if they've really adopted conspiracy theories in a big way. It's also relevant to equality issues as well, because basically when we have a particular set idea in our mind of the role of men or the role of women, it's sometimes very hard. Or if we have a particular bias against any LGBTQ community. You know, we may have biblical evidence to support our view, which again, we look for things to support our view, and we don't necessarily look deeper. We just, what we see is all there is. We don't understand necessarily because we don't look. And these are parts of the reasons why. The ostrich bias, I think as I said there, the name gives it away. So it's, again, these are all things that sort of work together, and they're similar and they interact. So our subconscious makes a decision to ignore the negative information available about whatever it is we believe, and we just focus on the positive of what supports our opinion. But also the important thing here is it actually increases our ignorance on a topic, because we're not looking from a fair and all-round perspective. We're just narrowing our view and just seeing what we want to see. So therefore, we are ignorant of other things, and we stay ignorant unless we have a reason to start to sort of broaden our view. So outcome bias is the next one. And this type of behavior focuses on the outcome of something rather than the circumstances that help to bring it about. So it's a little bit like the end justifies the means. And we've seen this a lot in regards to the information warfare, where there have been means employed that are quite, we would perhaps judge them as immoral even, and yet they've been employed for the purpose of achieving a political goal regardless, because they see that the end is all that matters. How you get there doesn't matter. And it's made worse when we start to just trust our gut feelings. If we just trust how we think, and we disregard facts and statistics. So that's that one. So similarly, we've got overconfidence bias. So this one's about getting just way too confident. I mentioned trusting our feelings or our gut feelings and ignoring facts and figures. And again, this is an aspect where we just become really confident in what we believe. We might sound confident. We put our views forward in a confident manner, but basically we're not necessarily looking at all the sides of an issue. We're just presenting our particular bias and our particular perspective, and we're confident that we're correct. So again, we see this with conspiracy theories. And again, I just want to stress, it's not just conspiracy theories that other people believe, it's also just our mindset and how we think, because even though we might be rejecting certain conspiracy theories that we once embraced, sometimes we still have that type of thinking going on, and this is what we need to really examine. And that's really a challenge sometimes, because it's so ingrained in our habits, even with how we think about equality issues, whether it's the roles of women in the home and men in the home, or whether it's about, as I said, those in heterosexual, homosexual relationships. All of those sorts of things we can often catch ourselves thinking in a certain way and then have to go, oh, hold on a minute, that's not right. So we have to get into the habit of questioning ourselves. The placebo bias. Now, obviously, placebo is probably a familiar term. We know that when they're doing studies on certain medications, they will use basically one group of people who will receive a placebo, which is just a sugar pill, if you like, for want of a better word, and then the other group of people will receive the actual medication, and nobody knows who's getting which except the research controllers, and then they will compare the results to be able to see whether the medication had an effect or not. And they know from different studies that have been done with placebos that actually placebos can work, because to some degree, not as much as the actual thing, but the amount that they work is quite surprising because of how we think and the power of our thinking. And I think the takeaway for this is just to keep in mind that how we think can be a very powerful thing. And so we need to be really mindful of how we're thinking and not just relying on our automatic thoughts. So survivorship bias. So this is a bias that occurs when we judge something just on the surviving information. There may be other information that's no longer available to us. So we make a decision just on what little is available, and it highlights the ignorance. We don't know what we don't know. And I'll just mention an example that I was reading about. If you have an ancient building, say a church building, a cathedral building that's, you know, hundreds of years old and it survived all this time. So we assume that they obviously built things better back then than what we do now, because anything we build now won't survive that length of time. So that's an example of that survivorship bias, because what we don't see is all the buildings that were built around the same time that didn't survive for whatever reason. And so we're making a judgment on very limited information and just on the information we have, but ignorant of information that's already gone. So it also reminds me of the literal to literal methodology, because we look at the literal, we take it to mean the literal, we don't consider the dispensations and what other things were influencing the writers at the time. We don't consider the impact of that, and we don't consider, you know, when we look at that study from Eden to Eden, and we can see the dispensations, and we can see how God has basically had to use humanity, or use the progression, if you like, if for want of a better word, as things became available, God could use them, but he couldn't really use them until they became available, whether it was the printing press or modes of transport or whatever it was. We didn't really consider those things. We, especially as conservative Christians, we tended to take, you know, a thus saith the Lord, a plain reading of inspiration. Oh, well, God said this, but we didn't actually sort of dig deeper. We didn't look at what information we didn't have. We just thought what we see is all there is. So we know now that that's not right. That's not the right way to look at things. There's a whole lot more information there that we need to dig out and start to uncover those jewels and have them shining through. So another one is selective perception bias. People use this bias when they overlook or forget things that contradict their beliefs or expectations. So a common example would be a smoker who ignores all the negative information and basically just continues to smoke. It might also be some of us who continue to consume the occasional food, for example, that we know isn't really good for us, but we tend to ignore the negatives and just continue regardless. So that could be something that applies to some of us in our day-to-day lives. So blind spot bias. So this explains how, as human beings, we're not very good at assessing our own bias levels. We're biased about being biased, if you like. So basically, we tend to assume, if we're asked, that we're not really biased, or we're not as biased as someone else. And we would be more likely to assess somebody in identical circumstances to us. We would assess them as being biased, but whereas we'd assess ourselves as not being biased. So that's just our natural inclination, something to be aware of. So I'm just, actually, that was our last one of the 12. So we're going to move on now. Anyone got any questions at this point? If not, that's fine. We just move on to the next psychological theory, which is the Dunning-Kruger Effect. So Elder Tess referred to this when she was talking about the ignorance of being ignorant. And it is really a cognitive bias, but it's kind of a big one on its own. So I've listed it separately. So it's a cognitive bias whereby people with limited knowledge or competence in a given intellectual or social domain greatly overestimate their own knowledge or competence in that domain relative to objective criteria or to the performance of their peers or of people in general. So this is really an interesting one as well. Just see if I can find where I've put that. So basically, we don't know what we don't know. And we've kind of covered it a little bit with those last biases where we were discussing literal to literal as well. And generally speaking, you can see why people maybe stick to their belief about something and defend it so vehemently because of their familiar aspects of it, but they're not necessarily aware of what things are actually controlling them in doing that. So just the next theory I want to look at is the Ramsey Theory. And this is another one that Elder Tess has discussed. And she was talking about it in relation to conspiracy theories. And this is one that really does impact conspiracy theories, as I hope you'll be able to see. So it's actually a mathematical equation, and it's been able to be expressed as a mathematical equation, which I'll show you in a minute. But it's at its most basic definition, it's really about creating order out of disorder or finding order amid disorder. Basically, you can use it during, as I said, you can prove it using mathematical equations, but you also see it, and one of the examples that Elder Tess used was this one, where people would put together, like in a big square, if you like, a whole lot of text, such as Moby Dick, the book, and they could actually find words in the letters of that text, and therefore they would suggest that they were hidden messages within this text. But when you understand Ramsey theory, you start to see how it would be impossible to not find patterns in that text when you've got such a broad number of options put together, especially when the rules become very, very loose, which I'll demonstrate in a minute. So another example of the Ramsey theory that I'd like to go through is the example that's often used with friends and strangers. So it'll use people that might be invited to a dinner party or something like that. And it doesn't have to be people, it doesn't have to be a dinner party. It's just one example to try to illustrate it. So if you actually had a number of people put together for whatever reason, the question then becomes, what is the smallest number possible so that there must be either 3 mutual friends or 3 mutual strangers? So obviously you could have 3 people and 3 of them could be mutual strangers, but we're talking about must be, and that's the key word there. So what's the smallest number where it's inevitable? It actually can't be avoided. There actually has to be 3 mutual strangers or 3 mutual friends or 3 connections in some way. That's really what you would say. And to illustrate that, I'm using just green for friends and red for strangers. And just as an example, I just mentioned you could have 3 that are friends or strangers, but it doesn't have to be that way, because literally you could make one of them not friends, and therefore that would actually mean that it's not a must. So you can see that 3 and even 4 people, that's not an absolute. It can't be mathematically defined that it's going to occur. So if you've got 2 + 2 = 4, it equals 4 every time. In this instance, this is not a 2 + 4, 2 + 2 = 4 scenario, because it can vary, and it doesn't have to be that 3 are going to be connected in some way. So if we look at 5, again, we still see that it's possible, but it's not an absolute. It's not going to happen regardless. So it's not a mathematical equation at this point. And what have I done there? Okay, if we go to 6, we can actually see here, now we've reached the point where it becomes a must. So there is no way to draw this where you're connecting lines. You cannot draw, it's impossible to draw it where 3 points are not connected at some point, whether it's green, whether it's blue, red, purple, doesn't matter the color, but the point being you're going to have 3 points are going to be connected every time somewhere in that scenario. So that's an example that's often used. And just to express it more in a mathematical equation, I'm not quite sure how you say it, but that's it there. And in its simplest form, we know that 3 and 3 equals 6. So what that really means is we know that 3, Ramsey Theory, 6 is the number that produces 3 connections regardless. And that's therefore the mathematical equation. And this is another more neat drawing of the same thing where it illustrates the fact that there's going to be 3 points connecting. So I'm kind of stressing that because to me, it was really difficult to understand to start with. So I hope I'm making it clear enough. So, because it is a little bit of a kind of a mind twister when you start thinking about it. So why is this relevant to conspiracy theories? And basically it's because when you start, if six is a relatively small number, if you think about it, if this as a number as small as 6, there must be a connection between those particular points. Can you imagine if you had 7, 8, 10, 1,000? Can you imagine? It's actually not able to be calculated. It's actually, it gives you endless possibilities. And that's pretty much how I've expressed it there. So if you have a conspiracy theory that's depending on a whole lot of factors, then you're going to get patterns or connections between them regardless. And just to go back to our original example of using text, I don't know if anybody remembers the Bible code. I do. And I actually thought this made sense at the time, I'm sorry to say. And now that I'm looking at it, I can see why it really doesn't. Well, I can see why it makes sense as in from the Ramsey theory's perspective, but I can't see why I actually thought it was some sort of hidden code, because I actually did think that's what it must be. So, but when you look at this, they could apply any rules they wanted. You'll notice the green, the different colored lines, they could actually have letters that are next to each other, letters that are separated. It can go diagonal, it can go in any direction really. And they can make patterns and they can make words. So how could you not make patterns out of this? Or how could you not make words out of this? And we're talking about the Bible, which has, I don't know how many letters or individual words. And if they used a computer to be able to pretty much put it into a big grid, and then they started searching for words, well, clearly they're going to find patterns. That's just inevitable because it's a mathematical inevitability that they're going to find patterns. And Ramsey theory is the proof of that. And it only takes 6 variables to actually guarantee a connection. So if you've got all of these variables, then you can imagine the connections are going to be quite large. So we've got Moby Dick was the example of that first text that I used. And they've put some prolific songwriters and all of their lyrics together, and they still find the same things emerge. And going back to the example that Elder Tess used, we've got, if you read from the bottom, M.L. King to be killed by them. So they read that as a message. And of course, if you even think about that logically, for these things to have been written before those events, they only ever have meaning when we know what the events are. There's no way anyone before this event would have known what that meant. They wouldn't have been able to even see that pattern because it didn't have any meaning to anybody. It was only became a thing once it had happened. So once we are familiar with something, that's when we see the patterns. We can't see a pattern with something we're not familiar with. And so that's another reason that it doesn't even make sense as far as a hidden message is concerned. And we look in the sky, we can see patterns. This is the Orion constellation, and you know they make a hunter out of that. It's a bit of a stretch in my mind, but the fact is we can make patterns. When we want to make patterns, we will make patterns. That's how our brains work. So Ramsey theory also states, given enough elements in a set or structure, some particular interesting pattern among them is guaranteed to emerge, which is what we've just been going through. So we naturally want to make sense of events, and our cognitive biases will encourage us towards whatever story best fits our internal narrative. Ramsey theory explains why there's no possible way there where the majority of the medical fraternity and scientists worldwide could cooperate consistently, even over a short period of time, let alone over a long period of time, to pull off conspiracies that, you know, envelop the globe, such as COVID-19 and the vaccines, etc. So this is just a current example we're living through, where people are assuming that there's this conspiracy going on, and for it to even be possible, it's just not possible. Basically, that's the point. And Ramsey theory shows why that's not possible. So moving on to the next one, and we're getting closer to the end here. We have a correlation and causation. So before I go on to this, are there any questions? I'll just ask that before we move on to the next point. Has anyone got any questions, or do you think it's clearer than perhaps, hopefully it's clearer than what it might have been before? But if you have any questions, please feel free to just jump in. So moving on, correlation and causation. Again, we see this more in relation to conspiracy theories, probably, but basically we've got, they're terms that are often used in research, statistical research. And in research, they're looking for correlations and they're looking for causations. They're looking at things that cause and maybe correlate, but what they've proven is that they're not inevitably together. So correlation means the dependence on a statistical relationship, how strongly a pair of variables are linearly related and they change together. And causation is whether something or not, you know, two variables or bivariate data are actually dependent on each other and cause the other to move for whatever reason. And an example of this is, you'll see with this example, we've got ice cream sales and sunglasses sales. And you'll see that with the points on the graph, they're all going up at kind of a similar rate, making similar progress. But we know that they're really, even though there's a correlation, we know that selling ice cream doesn't in any way influence selling sunglasses, or sunglasses, vice versa, don't influence ice cream sales. So there's no cause. Just because they follow a similar pattern does not mean they have to be related. So that brings us to correlation does not imply causation. And Wikipedia explains it like this. The phrase correlation does not imply causation refers to the inability to legitimately deduce a cause and effect relationship between two events or variables solely on the basis of an observed association or correlation between them. The idea that correlation implies causation is an example of questionable cause logical fallacy, in which two events occurring together are taken to have established a cause and effect relationship. So if you're going to assume that because they're closely related, that they must be somehow influencing each other, then we are establishing basically a logical fallacy in our thinking, and it's questionable thinking at best. So one does not apply to the other, or imply the other. So as an example, do vaccines cause autism? Well, no, it's been scientifically proven through numerous studies they don't. There was a couple of studies done early in the piece that suggested that there was a connection. However, it was proven later on that those studies were actually faulty, and they went on to do a whole lot more studies which actually totally disproved any thing that was assumed in that original study. And consequently, they've proven that there is no connection between vaccines and autism, as one really good example. And this is something that a lot of people have connected purely because of the fact that if you have a child and it's around the same age as when they're receiving their vaccinations and then they're diagnosed with autism, then you start to look for a reason why that's happened. So you start to connect things and events but just because something happened at the same time does not mean that it's actually related as a cause.
Hey, Lynne, I remember
Yes.
In my last semester at uni, we looked at this issue in a critical thinking subject I had to do.
Okay.
And one of the things the lecturer talked about was at the time they started a widespread vaccination program in school, science actually developed a new really accurate test to diagnose autism a lot earlier in children that linked up with the time that children were getting vaccinated at school. So it sort of ties back to that, that exact diagram you were showing before, that it was just unrelated events that were happening at the same time in children's lives that people went, oh man, these are obviously linked. And it actually had nothing to do with it. It's just, but because they were both happening and it was affecting such a large group of people, everyone jumped on it. And it's still a thing today, even though it happened decades ago.
And it's interesting that it is still a thing today. And why is that? I think largely because as people, we want to stick with what we originally believe. The original information we got must be right. You can see that, because people even still quote some of those faulty studies that have been proven to be wrong. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And it's interesting to see. Like I say, it's a lot easier to see with others when you're observing it from an outside perspective and you can see what other people do. It becomes a bit more challenging when we have to start questioning ourselves and how we might be doing similar things in other things. But thank you for sharing that. It's an interesting thing. I didn't realize that they'd actually developed their diagnostic procedures around the same time. So that's a really good point. So originally, I was looking at how conspiracy theories were being weaponized and basically how the particularly conservative Protestantism has been weaponizing conspiracy theories. And we've tended to take on that mentality or that mindset by our inclination. Hopefully most of us here have now had a lot of good reasons to question that. And I think most people who are still clinging to those things have actually gone, which is sad. But at the same time, hopefully that we can still refine our thinking and be prepared moving forward, because we've still got more to go and we've still got more to take on and understand and change about our thinking, because, well, I suppose the older we are, the more ingrained our thinking is. So perhaps that's why it's harder sometimes for people who are older, because they've just had a lot more years thinking that way, speaking personally, of course. So basically, as I mentioned, Elder Tess took us through the evangelical conservative right, how they set up their political agenda, and they've been working on that for decades. And they really intended to achieve their political goals regardless of the means they used. And they've adopted a lot of conspiracy theories. They're really using those in a lot of cases to establish more fear in people, which actually works to their favor, because people who are fearful tend to sort of look for an answer, or for, often even to God, to solve their problems. And they're trying to make a religious nation, regardless, according to their views and their apis bull and patriarchal views. So we also want to challenge our ideas about equality. And to finish, I'd just like to say that most of us are aware of the challenges that we've had as members of this movement, where our views about women and their roles were concerned. And we know back in 2019, we had some challenges accepting women's ordination, and the symbol of women wearing pants were introduced, and unfortunately a lot of people left around that time, but that was just the beginning. And the message of equality has been progressing and advancing through the various dispensations we've had ever since. And we're also, sorry, I'm having a tongue twister. We were also required to pass the test about conspiracy theories and the mindset of at the close of probation waymark for the priests. So if we're here today, we've hopefully managed to get through all of that, but we're still going. And we're approaching the end of the priest line, and we're beginning into the 144,000 line for most of us, and not beginning, but we're entering into that primary line. And we know that the Sunday law waymark is not what we thought. We've learned that it's not about the Sabbath, because that's not really a test for Adventists today. And we've learned that the challenge for us is about equality, primarily about equality. And basically the Sunday law waymark, as it gets closer, we're going to hopefully understand that more and more as we get to understand God's character. And we recognize that even with the LGBTQ community and the inequality that they've experienced, we know that a lot of that has come from just the position that women have held in society as being lesser to men in some way. And so anyone who has qualities of a woman, they're looked on as being a lesser person. And we know that this has been something I think which has really happened right from the beginning. When you go back to Adam and Eve, Adam's first response was to blame Eve. And it's interesting how the results of the curse would have probably just ended up becoming a very sad situation, because they basically would have, you could sort of see how women were then put in that position as being lesser than man. So it started right from there, and it's just gone all the way through. But we need to know now, especially as we're approaching, even though we can see that there's enlightenment in society about these issues, we also know there's a strong vein where there's a reluctance to change, and especially when it comes to conservative Christendom and that sort of an approach. So our big test is equality. And I guess the thing we need to work out is which stream of information are we going to drink from? Because that's the question we have to keep reminding ourselves. And so I've reached the end of the presentation, and we need to, going forward, we just need to ask ourselves, which stream do we want to drink from? And also, how are we drinking? Are we understanding things? Are we clinging to a lot of our automatic fast brain mechanisms of thinking? Are we actually allowing our slow brain to start being more logical and rational, to be able to see views, to be able to see that what we see isn't all there is, there's actually more. And it's not about literal to literal, it's about literal to spiritual, and understanding our methodology, our parable methodology, all of those things, they all work in together. So that's it for today. And I just hope that that's become, well, that was easy to follow. If you do have any questions, please feel free to ask. Any comments or questions? Otherwise, we can close in prayer.
One of the things that you mentioned was that Adam blamed Eve.
Mm-hmm.
Eve was the one who made the mistake first.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, Adam blamed her, then she blamed the snake, and the poor snake didn't have a leg to stand on.
Yes, I've heard that one. Yeah, I think it's naturally, if you think about some of the theories that I've just gone through, I think we covered in there how our natural inclination is to shift the blame onto somebody else. As human beings, we tend to do that, and we have to stop ourselves from doing that. If that's our automatic responses, we need to stop and think about that. And yeah, I think there's a lot of things that contributed to the beginning of things, and obviously sin was one of them. And it's just an interesting observation, I suppose, of how that all came together. So
yeah,
I think,
right there we could see the result of drinking from the wrong information. Right there in Eden, when Eve drink from the wrong information or stream of information.
yes,
Yeah,
yes.
the result was that Adam as well. Yeah.
Yes, that's it. That's right. So thank you for that. That's
And
true.
Lynne?
And it's always been two streams of information. Yes.
Was that Ray that was talking about a study he did at uni regarding
Yes,
correlation?
Ray.
Right. Well, I listened to a nurse when I was in New South Wales, and she worked in the statistics. And she was researching when babies are born and vaccinated, and the result, she said, was all of these babies, too many, had autism. And even though we've studied correlation is not causation, and I understand that, I was just thinking about it when Ray gave that answer. It started before the injection.
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of clarified, in other words, another interesting factor for me. It answered the question that's been in my mind for a long time.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. Actually, one thought that comes to mind with what you've just said is, even though correlation and causation are not automatically related, that doesn't mean you can't find a correlation and a cause that are related. Obviously, that's the whole point of, it's one of the points of research, is to actually try to find, in certain instances, the causes and correlations that actually do match up. But just because something is correlated of itself does not automatically mean it is a cause. That's the point, I guess, to take away. Yes. So there can be a relationship, but it's usually got to be supported by other facts and other data. So therefore, when they were doing the studies, for example, on autism and vaccines, they actually were able to show there was no cause. However, had they studied it and there was a cause, that would have been able to be identified. So then there would have been a connection. But obviously, studies proved that there was none. So just because something is correlated, it's not caused. Yes?
Some studies may prove it, but America has spent a small fortune paying people money through court cases because they did believe that they were correlated. So there must have been scientists and medical practitioners involved in those trials.
I think basically with regards to what you're referring to, I'd probably have to see exactly what the information is before I could really make too much of a comment, because just from what we've looked at in regards to this study, we know that there was, back in, I think it was the 70s, somebody did do a couple of studies that supposedly showed a connection. However, it was later on they realized that those studies were faulty. They weren't done properly. So, and then they went on to do more studies that were done properly. So maybe, depending, I don't know exactly which things you're referring to, but maybe there was, it was around that time, and maybe they felt that they had to try to, basically resolve issues at that point. But it was basically shown unequivocally that there is no connection, at least later on.
Oh, I've got a girlfriend whose son was 3 years old and perfectly fine, talking, doing all sorts of things. And then he had some immunisations given to him, very young, I think 3 too young. But anyway, he had some vaccinations, and he's very autistic now, really autistic.
But what we've found is that there is no relationship between the actual receiving of a vaccine and the development of autism. So what science has proven is there is no connection. So while it just so happens that he was at the age where he would receive vaccinations, and that he would have been receiving vaccinations likely from when he was maybe 6 months old and onwards.
No, I only started at 3.
Okay. So at that point,
our statistic, just sorry for butting in
no, that's
here.
okay.
There are studies to show that it's around the age of 3 that signs of autism really start to show.
Yes. So that was the point I was going to try to get to, is the fact that it just so happened that they happened at the same time. Now, he may have had a good feed of carrots that day too. You could say, well, maybe that's what caused it. Well, obviously we wouldn't think that. So my point is, just because it happened at the same time or around the same time, there is no proof that actually they were connected. It was unfortunate that they happened to be at the same time. And this is why our natural thinking is inclined to go, oh, well, they must be connected. And that's the point of what we tried to show you today, is that just because they happened around the same time does not mean they're connected. There's a good chance, had he not even received any vaccinations, he would have still developed autism. There may have been some other causes involved. There may have been some other factors involved. We don't know. But we do know scientifically that it wasn't the vaccination that caused it. It just happened around the same time.
Can I just say that one of the things that I learned when we did statistics was that people who have had car accidents have eaten carrots either within that week or within that month.
Okay.
So therefore, anybody who eats carrots is likely to have a car accident. So there's a correlation there to say that anyone who has carrots is definitely going to have a car accident, because everyone who has a car accident has probably eaten carrots.
That
So,
might be true.
Yeah, so therefore,
Or not.
So therefore, that's the correlation and causation thing. Just because something happens, it doesn't necessarily mean that
Okay, well, you be careful with your eating of carrots.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but sometimes it depends on the
Don't choose
doctors.
carrots and drive.
You know, those some of the doctors, if they are anti-vax doctors, they will present the case that it's connected to it. But if it's the pro-vaccine doctors who deal with the situation, they will their study will find that there's no connection. So really, it comes down to the doctors who handle the case, because the parents or those that are having the sickness, they will really take his word for it.
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead, Ben.
Sorry.
Go ahead, and I'll say my comment afterwards.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that I think there'd be not too many doctors these days who would suggest there was any connection when it comes to vaccination and autism. I think it would be very few and far between, unless there's some who are very stuck in that line of thinking, and really they're applying a lot of the biases that we've discussed today. So yes, so sorry, was that Josephine? You were going to say something?
Yeah, that's me. Some of the parents, or many of the parents that have autistic children, correlating to time of vaccination, were out asking the government in New Zealand not to make vaccines mandatory. And that's the reason behind why they want to have a choice, because they say, oh, my child was vaccinated my child was perfectly fine, normal, but when the child took the vaccine, the child became autistic. So because of the erroneous research or information that they have, they assume that and went on to not like vaccines.
Yes, and then they apply these other biases that we've discussed, where they just want to reaffirm what they already believe. So they only consume information that confirms it. They only listen to information that's going to confirm it. They're going to be solid in that belief. They're not really willing to look at anything that's objective or in opposition to what they believe. And so consequently, they are applying a lot of the biases that we've been discussing today. So they're not really looking at scientific research from an objective perspective, or looking at it with an objective opinion or view. So I just, maybe we need to close with a prayer, because we need to come back at 11. Is 11 going to be okay? Sorry, it's gone on a little bit longer than I anticipated with the questions, but thank you for the questions and the comments. I do appreciate those. Yes.
My daughter got vaccinated when she was born. I think it's a whooping and cough and something else, and I had to get vaccinated as well. So they get vaccinated before 2 years old.
Sorry, could you just say that again? I just had a bit of trouble hearing you properly.
When my daughter was born, she got vaccinated straight away when she came out.
Okay.
They get a whooping, I think it's whooping or something else, and then I had to get vaccinated as well. Anyone in the household to get vaccinated whooping for. So it's way before 2 years old.
Okay. Thank you.
Lynne, can
Yes.
I just say one quick thing?
Yes.
I'm staying with an Adventist couple at the moment, and they're not conservative. And it's really interesting because up until now, I've only had interactions with conservative Adventists, really. And the whole, you know, with the priest line and the Levite line, and then the line of the Nephilims. For the Levites, they're in their latter rain right now, almost, you know, at the close of probation. It's just so interesting coming in and seeing the impact of what's happening with COVID and the argument around it and the vaccine, and just the way first-handedly it's affecting these people and their lives and their opinions and their experiences. It's just quite amazing when you look at our lines and you see how what's happening externally is really the latter rain that's affecting liberal Adventists. I just find it absolutely astounding. And at the local Adventist school here, where I am, a local conservative doctor handed out fake certificates, vaccine certificates. Exemptions. Because there's about 40% of the school are all conservative Adventist teachers, and it got out on the local radio, and it became quite a thing. And then the local radio broadcaster, he rang the conference, and the conference, they were horrified to think that the school was promoting, you know, all this sort of stuff. And now it's the doctor's been handed over to the medical people. But I just wanted to say how it really is playing out in reality. It's astounding for me to just watch. It's just amazing.
Yes. Anyone can kneel or bow your head. We'll have a prayer and close.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you again for the time that we've been able to spend together, and hopefully we can learn from these things, that we may be able to apply them in our own lives, and we can move forward in a way that will be less biased, less inclined to faulty thinking, and more inclined to be able to look at things logically and rationally. We thank you for the blessings of the message and the messages you've been giving through all the teachers, and we just thank you for all your blessings that you've been pouring out upon us. And we just ask for continued blessing for this Sabbath day, and we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.